Welcome to the Truth Comfort Show. Today's returning guest is Matthew Hoh. He was recently on the show, literally last week, to discuss Julian Assange. He's here again today to do the second part of that, as it is quite a detailed story. In the first interview, we kind of just went over who is Julian Assange, who's Wikileaks, what are they famous for, what did they do, and kind of the events leading up to his arrest and some of the things they information wise they published. So I thought we could carry on that conversation today and go through his actual arrest, the charges, his treatment in prison, the kind of kangaroo court around everything, leading up to his eventual, now release. And then within that story, you have the Yahoo News investigation or kind of breaking news on the Trump administration's plans to assassinate Julian Assange in a London-style shootout when he was in the embassy there, which was not really reported that much. It was funny that Declassified UK did it, where they looked at all the BBC websites, and the only one who reported it was BBC Somalia. Trump administration draw up plans to assassinate a journalist in an embassy in London with the cooperation of British forces and the police. Whether it would, go ahead or not, it didn't, but that's not really the point. It just shows you just how political this is. And, I'm not here to support Kamala Harris or Trump, but Trump does get away with a lot with his followers, with his record. He's better with some stuff, but that definitely was not something to be too positive by, considering some of the types of people he pardoned was like the Blackwater people who murdered the people in Iraq and other people like that. Not Julian Assange. But anyway, I went off on a tangent there. Thanks again for coming on, Matt. How you doing?
Good. Thanks, Louis. And I think that story you're just talking about, that Yahoo News, David Isikoff, longtime investigative journalist, establishment journalist, so not someone that they could point to and say, this guy's not credible, he's a crank, he's got an agenda. Isikoff's been around for a long time. And he had, I think, 50 different sources establishing this story that the CIA had plotted to abduct and either assassinate Assange or abduct and bring him back to the U.S. They had plans to engage in a shootout on the streets of London, which, if you look at it, well, who would they be in a shootout with? Probably the British police. And it wasn't a big deal in the UK. And it certainly wasn't a big deal in the US. And the way when it's actually referenced in the US, it's referenced as if it was just a conspiracy theory. I saw something, I think it was either the New York Times or the Washington Post, forgive me. And as you said, this story is so big, it goes back 2 decades. It's so easy to not remember all the details of it. That's why I would recommend folks read Kevin Gastala's Guilty of Journalism. Great place to start to get like not a day by day, but a year by year understanding of what this was all about. But, even in the U.S., you have major establishment media, corporate media, that refuse to even recognize that the CIA did plan this. And Mike Pompeo, who was the head of the CIA, he didn't deny it. And in fact, he confirmed it because he said the people who leaked this information to Yahoo News and Isikoff should be arrested. Right. So he was confirming that these were actual real leaks. This thing really did exist. The other aspect of it, which is just as crazy, just kind of gets to your point about how this is political. And this is what Julian Assange, his family, the WikiLeaks teams have been saying, were said for the 14 years of this, essentially, from the time he was under house arrest through his time in asylum at the embassy, at the Ecuadorian embassy, to his time in Belmarsh. This is not a legal issue. This is a political issue. And you saw this with the British courts when they approved Julian Assange's extradition, and the Julian Assange's legal team attempted to appeal. And they appealed on a number of grounds. And one of those grounds was like, look, you're going to extradite Julian Assange to the government that plotted to assassinate him. This is against British law, and it's against, EU law. It's against international law. You can't do this. And the way the British court got around this was saying, well, he's going to be extradited. So essentially they're getting what they want. So there's no need to assassinate him. So it's a moot point. like this incredibly Orwellian, upside down logic where, yeah, the people who wanted to kill him, they did want to kill him, but you know what? They're getting what they want, so they're probably not going to kill him. So we'll give. I mean, like just this type of, But again, it's all political, and this is something that Julian Assange spoke about very cogently, very very articulately in his one public appearance, and I recommend people to go back to September when he spoke in Strasbourg, France, to the Council of Europe. And listen his opening words, but especially where he really, wow, this man just endured all this, and here he's able to just brilliantly explain the reality of the situation that we're living in right now. He talked about lawfare and this idea that lawfare is not the use of the legal system to achieve justice or to litigate some remedy, but it's to achieve a political end. And that's essentially what you saw here through his time in house arrest, his time in asylum at the Ecuadorian embassy, to his time in Belmarsh. This was always political. It was not about the law. And that's essentially what the U.S. Justice Department determines, or they have to come clean on it when they make the plea deal with him last spring, because this is a political persecution and prosecution. It's got nothing to do with the law, because this won't stand up in an American court. And more to the point, this is not going to stand up in the British court.
Yeah, I completely forgot about the bit where Mike Pompeo actually came out. Just for people who don't know, he was the Secretary of State under Trump, but also the CIA director between the 2 points. And I did forget that he did come out and say these people need to be arrested because of what they leaked, which, as you say, completely.
Yeah.
If it was a crazy conspiracy theory, he would have just said, "Oh, that's nuts." But he's actually saying these people need to be punished, and you can only punish people who have leaked classified information. If the information doesn't exist, then there's nothing to, there's no classification for it. So that's definitely an example of the weight behind that story. And I encourage people to read it. I'll put it up on the screen in the show notes. But I think, it was like 30 to 50 inside sources from the government, who obviously, I'm guessing this is why it didn't go through, is if you have that many people talking to the news after, it was just so wacky that they must have opposed it. Again, with this story, whether it went all the way up to Mike Pompeo and Trump, and it, other people to talk them out of it, we don't, I guess, know the exact details. I'd have to refresh myself on the story. But the fact that even discuss it, I mean, is there any precedent for this happening in a European kind of allied country? I mean, you could see this happening in other continents around the world, but has there ever been a similar type of scenario in Europe?
Certainly you had during the global war on terror, you had the United States renditioning people, kidnapping people, and they did that in European countries, most famously in Italy, where they were so sloppy in it, the Italian law enforcement and courts were able to identify the 15 people involved. And there was an indictment for these American Central Intelligence Agency officers in Italy. There are stories about assassinations. John Kiriakou, the CIA officer who went to prison for discussing the U.S. government's torture program. So the only person who went to prison for the U.S. government's torture program was the CIA officer who actually confirmed it existed. So in the same vein, Julian Assange is a publisher. He's a journalist. Kiriakou is a whistleblower. But the same vein, Kiriakou talks about an Iranian scientist being assassinated by the CIA in Switzerland. So there's things like that that are out there. Dan Ellsberg, they put a hit. The Nixon White House, Nixon and Kissinger put a hit on Dan Ellsberg, and I forget off the top of my head. I forget the details why that didn't go through, but there was an attempt or a desire to physically punish Ellsberg, either by beating him severely or killing him. So that is all there. And then, of course, you go back to the 1960s, to the assassination attempts on Fidel Castro, and then you go back to the late 1940s to the assassinations that occurred all throughout Europe following World War II, led by the Americans trying to make sure that Western Europe and Southern Europe didn't go communist. right? I mean, so just as the same thing on the other side, the Soviets, people falling out of windows, all those stories, I mean, so this certainly is something that exists. It's real. How often it occurs now it's all, the way they do it, the use of proxies to assassinate people. So certainly Muammar Gaddafi was killed by the U.S. and NATO, not through their hands though, but rather through allied or proxy forces on the ground. So yeah, I mean, it still exists. I think the thing with the Assange assassination was that it was so brazen, right? Or the desire for it was so brazen, and it would be so overt. And again, it wasn't happening similar to like the kidnappings in Italy. It 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 was against an allied country. And so when you wonder, well, who would the shootout be with, that they talked about, it'd be with the British police. I mean, so that type of arrogance, that type of entitlement, that type of righteousness to not just violate an embassy, pull somebody out, or assassinate a political opponent, but also too that if anyone stands in our way, we'll kill them, including our allies, our chief allies, law enforcement people. So it shows the mentality. It also shows that a lot of these people are in power. Their experience is informed by Tom Clancy novels. It's informed by, TV shows like 24 with Jack Bauer, things like that. And so, we have to keep in mind that a guy like Mike Pompeo, he believes such things, and he believes in the necessity and the righteousness of such things. And he also believes in the slogans or talking points. I mean, I just discussed this the other day on another show regarding what Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian, who was executed by the Nazis in 1945, but what he said in 1942 when trying to explain what happened to the German people. And in his essay, After 10 Years, the part that's the most famous part of that essay is about stupidity, and about how a stupid person is more dangerous than a malicious person. An evil person recognizes the acts that they're doing. There's a calculation involved, and they go forward based upon their interests. But a stupid person is doing so because of the emotion of it, because of the slogans of it, the talking points of it. And Bonhoeffer talks about how you can have intelligent, stupid people who are also intelligent people. So you can have someone like Mike Pompeo, who is intelligent, but he is also stupid in Bonhoeffer's explanation, in that he believes the talking points, he believes the slogans, he believes the myths, and that's what he rests himself upon. And so anyone who violates that, he gets very angry towards, in a way that makes him more dangerous, as Bonhoeffer would say, than an evil person. This is essentially what you're up against. And you see how this intersects with what Julian Assange and WikiLeaks were doing, because what they did by publishing this information on the United States' crimes overseas, in particular, was expose reality to, as Bonhoeffer would say, the stupid people. And I've encouraged people to go and read that essay, After 10 Years. It's only 25 pages long or something like that, or at least just the stupidity part, just to get a better, because I'm probably butchering it. I wish I had it in front of me. I could do a better job of explaining it. But you'll see this type of the anger that comes from those who are wed to the myths, wed to the narrative, wed to the slogans and the talking points, when that is upset. And that's what you see here, certainly with the Assange and WikiLeaks story.
Just for reference, Daniel Ellsberg he released the Pentagon Papers about the Vietnam War.
Right. Yeah,
yeah. No. And with John Kiriaka as well, really nice guy. I had him on the show to speak about the CIA torture program, the black sites, the renditioning, as you mentioned there, and all the background. So I'd encourage people to watch that, and just him in general. Really nice guy. Just going back, I guess, who started on the assassination, which is a good point to start, because hopefully it pulls people in and realizes, I didn't know about that. That's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
Maybe whatever you think about the guy Assange, that's probably a bit far, because examples with Castro and other people go, well, he's a bad guy, or he's a communist, or that was an Iranian scientist, whatever. Assange is an Australian citizen who is the head of basically a publishing group, and a journalist who's in the UK in an embassy protected by international law. So it's like even wackier when you think about that. But just going back to Assange, his arrest, the charges, can you just lay out what's he being charged with? What was the cause of that? And kind of the events that led to his arrest?
He was the indictment was primarily concerning violations of the Espionage Act. And the Espionage Act in the United States goes back to the First World War. It is on its face what it says it is, an espionage, providing information to the enemy. The reality is, both in the way it is written and the way it has been utilized, particularly during the First World War, it's meant to suppress political opposition. So in the First World War, it was widely used thousands of times, and hundreds, if not thousands, of anti-war dissidents in the United States were put in prison, including the socialist Eugene Debs, who in 1916 campaigns for president from prison. And, but the idea is that they utilize the Espionage Act in a manner that at that point it was utilized to suppress any type of political dissent. How in more modern times, particularly beginning under President Obama, it's used to go after whistleblowers. And the key thing about the Espionage Act is that you are essentially disclosing any information the government doesn't want disclosed is a violation of the Espionage Act. And there's no public interest defense. So whatever your intentions are in disclosing the information that you are disclosing, whatever your intentions are as a whistleblower, it's meaningless in an American court because there is, again, no defense for the public interest. So particularly under President Obama, it's utilized to go after whistleblowers. And I think the Obama Justice Department, off the top of my head, I think uses it 12 or 13 times maybe. Julian Assange, they break a barrier with Julian Assange, and the Obama White House does not go, and the Obama Justice Department does not formally go after Julian Assange during the Obama presidency. What happens is Julian Assange, he leaves Paris in the summer of 2010. He goes to London. At that point, as we discussed in the previous episode, the Iraq and Afghan war leaks have been out and about, and the American government is very unhappy, and they want to get them. They're uncertain, the American government, how they're going to go about doing this. But the pressure on Assange is enough, basically, to have him on house arrest by the British government. And then he's able to get to the Ecuadorian embassy in 2012 and get asylum there. And then he's in the Ecuadorian embassy, just to keep people up to speed, up until 2019, when the British invade the Ecuadorian embassy based upon an agreement with the new Ecuadorian government. It's a whole other thing we can get into, and then they put him in Belmarsh prison for 5 years until he's released and does the plea agreement with the United States government back in June, if I remember correctly, or July, whichever one. But the Obama White House, the Obama Justice Department realizes that going after Julian Assange on an Espionage Act charge takes this to a whole other level, because Assange is a journalist. WikiLeaks is a publishing outfit and has never been utilized. The American government had not used the Espionage Act to go after journalists, to go after media. And essentially the issue, as I think Barack Obama himself says, is that there's a New York Times problem, that if we go after Julian Assange for these leaks, then we have to go after, or we're able to go after, any other news outlet. And so if we're going to put Julian Assange in jail for publishing government secrets, what happens when the New York Times does it? And this is what keeps the Obama White House. They hold the threat over Assange's head. It's clear, and I think the Obama White House is happy, the Obama administration is happy to have Assange shut away with this fear of extradition to the U.S., this fear of indictment by the U.S., as a warning to other journalists. And I think the Obama administration is happy enough with that. And this way they're not crossing the line into becoming, getting into that New York Times problem. Trump administration comes in 2017. At about that time, WikiLeaks releases what are called the Vault 7 documents, which is a really historic release of information regarding the CIA's surveillance capabilities. So if people have heard how the CIA could use your television to spy on you, This is where it comes from. It comes from the Vault 7 leaks, and the Vault 7 leaks gets into all technical kinds of technical aspects that to like you and I, Louis, and folks watching, well beyond what we understand. But to foreign intelligence services, this was a big deal. I mean, basically, essentially, the crown jewels of the CIA were let loose with these Vault 7 leaks. And the CIA is apoplectic. Mike Pompeo is apoplectic. This is when Mike Pompeo declares Wikileaks a hostile, non-government foreign intelligence service, or whatever the exact phrase he uses. And this is about when you see the formulation of this plan to either kidnap Julian Assange or to kill him. The Trump White House pushes forward, and they actually indict Julian Assange on these espionage charges. They also have some other charges in there about that are essentially hacking charges, which are completely bogus, always were bogus. They have one witness, the guy, Theodore, I'm going to butcher his name, Icelandic guy. He's an FBI informant. He is the least credible person in the world. And I'm blanking on his name. It's a tough Icelandic name. I butcher it anyway. But, you know, I mean, but there's these hacking charges. And this is what's used to distract the commentary about this, because now it becomes this thing about, well, Assange is not a journalist. Well, how come he's not a journalist? What is he doing that's different than the New York Times or the Guardian or whoever? Well, it's because he hacked. Journalists don't hack. Look, the U.S. government says he's hacking, and the hacking charge was complete nonsense, completely untrue. And they stuck it on there just to further the narrative, to keep the discussion going along the lines of he's not a journalist, the Espionage Act doesn't apply to him, the First Amendment doesn't apply to him, on and on and on. And in 2019, the British, at the American request, go into the Ecuadorian embassy. They've already worked this out with the Ecuadorian government. There have been a change in the Ecuadorian government. Favors were passed to the Ecuadorian government, of course, for this. And the British pull Julian Assange out of the embassy and put him in Belmarsh. He's there for 5 years. During that time, they initially say he's in Belmarsh because he skipped bail. Regardless of anything with that, the reality is that he's in Belmarsh for way too long for a thing such as skipping bail. Then it's about him becoming a flight risk, and just one false explanation, rationale, excuse after another from the British why they're keeping this man in solitary confinement in Belmarsh. The idea at this point has become extraditing him, and though we want him, extraditing him is going to be difficult. If he ends up in an American court, this is going to be a First Amendment case, a free speech, journalism freedom case. We could lose this, so what really you start to see happening in the Trump administration and in the Biden administration is this desire to see Julian Assange die in prison. And he is kept in Belmarsh prison in utterly horrific conditions, brutal conditions. His health had already been deteriorating. The Brits do everything to push that deterioration of health, and he becomes not just sick, but also suicidal. He's so sick that he can't even attend his own extradition hearings. And so the idea that we're making an example out of him, right? So there's a theory that the Americans don't ever want to get this to court because, again, they could lose on a First Amendment case in the U.S. And if it doesn't go to court and it's open-ended, then it's never disproven and they could do it again. And the most important thing is the fear. It's the chilling effect that this has, right? So the idea that this could happen to me, if I publish something the U.S. government doesn't like, if I publish something exposing the U.S. government's crimes, if I embarrass the U.S. government, if I prove them wrong, this could happen to me. And for the U.S. government, the theory, my theory and others is that this was good enough. This was good enough. But the British court system just kind of can't have this guy there languishing. So he has to they're going through his extradition process, which gets drawn out, and it takes 5 years. And a number of judges, many of whom have amazing conflicts of interest, amazing conflicts. I mean, you have judges who are, this story, this is why I say go and read Kevin Gustava's book or the work of Stefania Maritza or a number of other folks out there. And because it's just so fascinating, just the levels of corruption, the levels of cruelty, and the imperial levels of just villainy goes on here. But at times, Julian in the British courts is in front of British judges who have worked directly for the British intelligence services, right? I mean, he's in front of British judges who have personal relationships with the prime minister, right? Where money has been exchanged between them, kind of thing. I mean, the stories are just unreal, and this is what Julian is going through. But the idea being is like stretch it out. Hope he dies. If he dies, we really win because we don't have to actually fight this in court, and it's hanging over the head of journalists and media outlets out there that you could be next. What eventually happens is that Julian wins the right to appeal. This happens in May of this year. And with that, the Justice Department knows that essentially it's over. This is what was going to occur was that the appeal process was going to begin for Julian Assange in the British court. The British court was not going to humiliate itself. There was no way it could not acknowledge that this is a issue of press freedom. They had already kind of gotten around the issues. It's really amazing how they do so. Again, kind of like that mental gymnastics of saying the question of extraditing this person to the nation that wanted to assassinate them is moot because, I mean, that type of mental gymnastics, that Orwellian type of logic, it was in terms of because for a number of reasons, the extradition should never have gone forward. One of them being that this is a political case, and under British and European and international law, you can't extradite people who are accused of political crimes, who are political prisoners. But the British courts gets around that. But this issue of press freedom, this issue of Julian Assange as a journalist, as well as the fact that the Americans have come back to the British and the Americans have said, we cannot assure Julian Assange will receive protections under American law. Being that the American First Amendment, which includes the right of free speech as well as the right of a free press, will not be applied to a foreign national. We cannot provide that assurance. And so you've got two counts now. One, this is a free press case, but then on the other, that you're going to extradite someone to a nation that is going to be biased against him because of his nationality. So you're running against British law, you're running against European law, you're running against international law. It was clear that there's no way around that. So the Americans recognize this. The story about this is really fascinating. The British lawyers are essentially going to have to recuse themselves in the process because it's an unwinnable case. I mean, the whole thing is, in the Americans' Justice Department, this is when they say, okay, we will make a plea deal. And they make a plea deal, and law, I know, finally getting around to this point. So in June, I believe it was June or July of this year, we all wake up in the morning here in the U.S. to news that Julian Assange has accepted a plea deal and he'll be set free within a day or two. And essentially, it's one count. He pleads guilty to one count of espionage, of the Espionage Act. And at the plea sentencing, at the plea deal hearing, he's asked to explain what he did. And what he's pleading guilty to, and he essentially says, I plead guilty to journalism. I plead guilty to taking information from a source and publishing it. He's guilty of journalism, and the court accepts it. The court, if you go back and look at the American court, the judge in the case, she is very receptive to what Julian Assange is saying. You see other aspects of this plea deal. One of the slanders against Assange and WikiLeaks have been that their revelations in these Iraq and Afghan war logs had gotten people killed, that they had put American troops in harm's way. And it was clear for years that wasn't the case. Immediately after these leaks by these revelations, these releases by WikiLeaks, the American Pentagon, led by a general, conducts a review of all the documents. It becomes an interagency review. So it's like 18 different U.S. federal agencies are involved reviewing all these WikiLeaks documents. And what they come back with is that we have found nothing that caused harm. The best the Americans say is that it may have caused harm, right? This really nebulous type of vague, speculative, hypothetical harm, right? That doesn't exist. One of the aspects of the plea deal is that established that as fact, that no harm came to anyone because of these leaks. We know this already because it had been reported. We know this already because in Chelsea Manning's trial, the American government had to admit that no harm had come from these releases. And the same thing too, all throughout the extradition process, the American government, through their British representatives, would admit that nothing had come, no harm had come from these releases. That didn't stop the American press from, up until the day of Julian Assange's release, repeating that harm had come because of the releases. And then you have to really search in the American press to find this part of the plea deal where the American government admits again, for the nth time, that no harm had come. So I mean, that story in itself about the harm or the supposed harm, that's a real good microcosm for the misinformation, the inaccuracies, the narrative that drives this persecution and prosecution of Julian Assange for years. Last thing I'll say about all this is that the American government still views this not as a defeat, but as a win. And Julian Assange will say this himself. There was no adjudication. There was no final decision on whether or not the American government had the right to do what it did, whether or not Julian Assange had actually violated the Espionage Act. It's a plea deal, so a plea deal doesn't set precedent in the United States. However, it leaves it open-ended in the sense that nothing was established. So the American government is free to do this again. And the American government will say, it's not because our judicial system said it wasn't right. It's because it's got hung up on a technicality in the British courts. So, I mean, you have this ability to go after journalists and media organizations is still there. It's unchecked, as well as the example, the chilling effect of Julian Assange's treatment for 14 years, essentially, is there as well. The Americans got their pound of flesh and they're displaying it to everybody. So, this is one of the reasons, I may have said it last time, why I still hang Julian Assange's poster on my wall. One, to remember this, that it's still out there, that this is still an issue, that the issue of transnational repression of speech in the press by the American government is still there. And if anything, it's stronger or more dangerous than it was before. I also have the poster up there still to remind people that Julian Assange needs a pardon, as well as to remind people that things are possible. We were hopeless. Many of us were hopeless back in the spring. We were certain that Julian was going to be extradited to the U.S., and then it didn't happen. And it happened, this is what Julian, his family, and WikiLeaks would say, it didn't happen because people stood up and prevented it from happening.
Yeah, I think you laid out the case really well there, went through a lot of different sections of this case. And I'm happy to circle back to what you kind of finished on there with him eventually being released, which was quite a surprise. Maybe at the end we could talk about that again. Maybe the influence of the Australian government doing a big lobbying campaign where it became probably just too embarrassing for them and whatever else around that. But just going back to what you said, so there's a few things we can go through. One, his arrest at the Ecuadorian embassy, and then also the change of hands of the government there that allowed that. His treatment in prison, the conditions, and then also the judges. Just to, I guess, go back in chronological order. So can you just explain to people what happened there with the original Ecuadorian government allowing him asylum, and then a new government comes in, and then this British operation where they arrest Assange, and I can provide a few more details on that, as Sir Alan Duncan, who was a MP in the UK, been in governments quite a high level, and he released a diary, and he talks a lot about the arrest of Assange. It was called Operation Pelican. It had loads of MPs involved, cabinet members, the police, like the Foreign Office, just complete stuff. You think your MPs out there doing stuff for the local community, but they're actually planning this massive operation to arrest this journalist on behalf of the Americans. And I wouldn't just say on behalf of them, because clearly they're that invested. It's not just we're doing this to serve American power. They're clearly very much hate him. He called him a dirty little worm or something. And he talks about how they have a picture of the people who was involved in this. They got a picture together. It's signed. They all signed it. They had photos. They had a party to celebrate. He said throughout the years, all the interviews he did, he just couldn't keep the smirk off his face because of it. Like, he's genuinely proud. But So that's worth a read. Declassified UK did work on that, where he's just telling you, going through it, and he was also friends with one of the judges who was involved in this. But just going back to the Ecuadorian aspect, can you just explain that to people?
Yeah, I mean, so essentially, when Julian Assange seeks asylum in 2012 with the Ecuadorian embassy, the Ecuadorian government is a leftist government at that point. They are, simply put it, they're opponents of the American empire, right? Like many leftist governments in Central and South America. And so they welcome Julian Assange just in the same way that Ed Snowden, when he leaves Hong Kong in 2013, I think it was 2013, right? When Ed leaves Hong Kong in 2013, and his ultimate destination, if I remember correctly, was Ecuador, or that they were going to provide, Ecuador was going to provide asylum to Ed Snowden. And then, of course, Ed gets stuck transferring planes in Moscow, the United States, pulls his passport, making Ed essentially citizenless, nationless, and he's stuck. There's a great story, how he has to live in the international terminal of the Moscow airport for about 3 weeks or so until the Russians grant him asylum. So Ecuador saw itself, and the Ecuadorian government saw itself as being a safe haven for those who were going to stand up against the American empire and expose its crimes. Change in government 2016, early 2017, I forget when, but essentially now the conservative government, right-wing government comes in, friendly to the Americans. There's a transactional aspect. Escapes me top of my head what the quid pro quo was, but there was a good deal of quid pro quo. There was a quid pro quo, but more importantly, the Ecuadorian government, the right-wing government comes in, does it because they go along with the Americans and the Brits because that's what they believe they should be doing. They're a part of the American empire now. They're on the side of the Americans. This is what we're going to do. So anyway, they give for a couple of years prior to the British going in. It's a slow process of the Ecuadorians trying to force Julian Assange out, and so they limit him in his office in terms of what he's able to do, his, say, computer access, what food's allowed to be brought in. They make life really difficult for him, as well as also essentially allowing the CIA to come in and spy on him. So the CIA, through a private Spanish company, puts all types of devices throughout the embassy. And I should point this as well. I visited Julian Assange in the embassy in 2014. And it's next to Harrods there in the Harrods, the big shopping department store in the center of London. And people who know that area, there's Lamborghinis and Bugatti. I mean, like it's a very wealthy area. And you pull up next to the embassy, and it's a pretty big 5 or 6 story building, nice big brownstone British London type building. And you think, well, this isn't so bad. He's got this whole building. And then you realize, no, he's on half of one floor in the building. So essentially, he's in a 3-bedroom apartment is essentially what he's in, maybe a little bit larger, 3-bedroom apartment with like an extra living room, essentially is what you're talking about. And they make the new Ecuadorian government makes his life very difficult. They allow the CIA, again, comes in and spies on him, another gross violation of all types of international laws and conventions and treaties. But, and then eventually the Ecuadorians say, yes, of course, you can come in and take him to Belmarsh. And that's what happens in April of 2019, I believe.
Yeah, and as I said, it's worth reading the Declassified UK article about Sir Alan Duncan's diaries, where he was just obviously so pleased with himself. This was probably not reported at all in the media. If you type in Operation Pelican now, it would come up because he's put it all in his diaries because he's really proud of it. He puts through like minute to minute, the conversations he's had, everything where he's like, we're working day and night for this. We're going back and forth for the Ecuadorian government, all of this type of thing. We have the team ready. We're watching it on TV, they really did enjoy this. And I think it was like 19 like MPs, cabinet members, foreign officers were part of a police operation. That's how political it was. It wasn't just a police operation.
Yeah.
He's watching it live and all this type of stuff. And he's a fairly serious character himself, because he also disclosed in his diaries about how there's a team of kind of British people from, BP, MI6, himself, who basically are constantly advising the government in Oman in the Gulf nations as kind of a group, of collection of, basically the state within the state, oil interest, arms interest, intelligence, where they're part of this group who regularly is advising, the Oman government. So it's quite interesting there. But yeah, it was crazy just how smug he is through the stuff he says. And he, after the arrest, he went to Ecuador himself, thanked the president. There was gifts exchanged. It's just all in his diary. Like, it's crazy. But just moving a little bit forward, as people can read that themselves. What was his treatment like in prison? Actually, no. So before we get to there, let's stay on the political aspect. Go back to the bit about the judges. I mean, again, I'm not sure how much detail you know in, but again, Declassified UK. There's articles. So there's the judge who has defended for MI6, the MOD, right. And then there's the one who has a personal relationship with Sir Alan Duncan, the person I just mentioned there. Then there's a judge who has links to like Theresa May, and then their children. Like, it's crazy. So can you just lay down?
There was like a personal loan involved with regards to Theresa May. I mean, like, so the person, if people want to read more about this, the person to read is Ambassador Craig Murray. Craig Murray, of course, whistleblower himself, exposed. Craig was in Uzbekistan, I believe, right? And Craig, when he was the ambassador there, the British ambassador to Uzbekistan, exposed that the Uzbek government was torturing people, and the British government was okay with it. And he had consequences for that. And but Craig's writings, he's a very close friend of Julian's and Julian's family. He was attended the extradition hearings, trials throughout the time in London, and he wrote about them. But Craig Murray's articles on this type of the conflict of interest is really important. I mean, this gets to essentially what Julian Assange is exposing here. It's the corruption of the elites, the willingness of, say, the journalist class, right, the elite journalist class, to not report on the crimes of the American empire because they are a part of the empire, right? The best way to articulate it is to quote the late George Carlin. When George Carlin says, "It's a big club and you ain't in it." And that's essentially what Julian Assange, one of many things that he's demonstrating, WikiLeaks demonstrates, is that this information is available to the elite press, to the corporate press, to the traditional or legacy media, mainstream media, whatever you want to call it, and they choose not to publish it. And then when they do publish it, they win awards for it. And then after they win awards for it and the American government goes after journalists like Julian Assange, organizations like WikiLeaks, the elite corporate, traditional, legacy, mainstream media, et cetera, do not do anything to defend him, even though it was because of Julian Assange that they won Pulitzer Prizes and journalism awards and all types of things for the work that they published based upon the information the documents Julian Assange provided them. So, I think that's the key thing, is that there is a corruption within the elite establishment that allows for such things as Julian's persecution and prosecution in a manner that, when it's displayed, is despicable, is sickening. And so, I think that's what happens, and this is something that Craig Murray will argue, is that the court, to go along with the Americans, even though they had gone along with them for 5 years, they had run out of that type of political capital. They had run out of that space to go fully along with Americans and to extradite Julian, in spite of the fact that he would be biased against as an Australian national, that he would be charged with breaking American law without receiving the benefits of being protections under those laws, and the fact that this is ultimately a free speech, free press case, a case of journalism being subjected to political lawfare, was too much. Like that is even too much for them, because they still have to maintain an image. They still have to uphold their part of their elite bubble. It's interesting. You see all that, the conflict of interest. You rattled off 3 or 4 of them. There are a couple others which I'm trying to recall. I think there were at least 2 of the justices have been involved with MI5 and MI6 before. There was the issue with Theresa May, with Duncan, and I'm trying to remember, there was like 1 or 2 others out of the 8 or 9 judges that Julian Assange went before. I think it was about that many throughout these 5 years in terms of Belmarsh. About 5 of them had these types of conflict of interest that were just glaring, that were just obscene, and it still is allowed to go forward. So doing that, the British court system used up whatever capital they had. And it gets to this point at the end in 2024 where they've essentially got no more to give. And this is when I was in London back in May, and I hosted the live stream for WikiLeaks that day outside the court, where the decision was handed down by the court that Julian Assange would be allowed to be extradited. Would be allowed to appeal the extradition, and that essentially is a death sentence for the American case at that point. Ambassador Craig Murray, was one of the few who was hopeful that day, because he understood it. He understood that, yes, this is essentially a political case, and that the British court had used up everything it had to get to this point, and it couldn't go any farther, because at that point they would be perpetrating a farce that was not just ruinous to them in their image, but ruinous to the foundation of the British court system, right? So this, going along with the American extradition at that point, would have caused such harm to the British system might not have been able to recover from it, right? It would have been such a farce to do so that it was impossible for them to do so. And eventually that leads to Julian's eventual release. But yeah, I mean, this conflict of interest, this idea that you have these justices, and yeah, like I said, best thing is to go and read Craig Murray's work on it, because some of the quotes from these judges are just really jaw-dropping in their previous work. Quotes from those who know the judges, quotes from those who the judges are connected with, just in the sense of what they want to see happen to Julian Assange. I mean, it just wouldn't be allowed in any decent court system. And so it really exposed the British courts for the elite conglomerate that it is that supports this empire.
Yeah, I think the one with Alan Duncan, he was friends with the judge since the days of university. They went to Oxford together, like there's connections, and they're, he's probably in his like 60s, 70s now. Like the connections go back a long time. And with Theresa May as well, I think it's her husband. He either sits on a board of an arms company or has shares in it. Because I remember when Theresa May, Macron, and Trump did airstrikes from Syria. I think again it was like Declassified UK had like an article about her husband has shares in like an arms company or sits on the board, something like that. It's just like, yeah.
And there is also too, I'm remembering now, I think there was something with Boris Johnson as well too. There was an issue, I think, alone with Boris Johnson. There was some type of, if I'm remembering this right now, it's going to bother me because I don't know off the top of my head, but like there was something really crooked, and it was allowed to, continue forward. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And also there with the media, Sir Alan Duncan in his diaries literally said about just the day of the arrest or the day after, he organised with his friend in the Daily Mail to put a piece out about it, like a hit piece on Assange, like straight away, ready. So there's the collaboration with the media, and just in general was something I wasn't aware of, and most people, I'm not sure how it works in America, but on the British government website, they have a bit about, any meetings that happen, dinners and stuff like that. And I mean, British officials and prime ministers meet the people in the media all the time. Like Boris Johnson, there was I think it was an 11-day period, and he met someone in the media every day, including Rupert Murdoch, including the head of the Daily Mail. It's not just like editors-in-chief or editors of the defense. Like they meet people in the media all the time, cabinet officials, Michael Gove, lots of them constantly meeting, and all you get, the bit of information they said, yes, they met on this day, and it says general discussion. That's it. That's all you get. And it's like, if Rupert Murdoch's been around that long and he's being the prime minister, it's like, who's giving orders to who? You know what I mean?
Right.
Like,
That's exactly right.
he's
Yep.
gone through so many prime ministers. You know, he helped get Tony Blair elected, and you know, normally who he backs. You know, he owns the Sun, the Times, the Wall Street Journal. He used to own Sky, and then everything in Australia as well. And it's like, when this guy meets the prime minister, I'd quite like to know what's being said. And but it's crazy the relationship there. And also Keir Starmer, the current prime minister of the UK, he was part of the Crown prosecution service in the mid kind of 2010s or so. I think they destroyed the files to do with WikiLeaks. I can't remember if it was that, Jimmy Savile, or Israel, but he was swimming around all of that time.
Yeah.
He was, you know, you see him with the funny little hat on. But yeah, Keir Starmer was back there with Jimmy Savile, Israel, and then also Julian Assange. I can't remember which one he destroyed the files for. But just moving to Assange's treatment in Belmarsh, am I correct? Well, first of all, Belmarsh is probably the most serious prison in the UK. It's called like the Guantanamo Bay of the UK, where they send highest level terrorists, things like that. Not always, because there are lower level people there. But am I correct that he was kind of in solitary confinement, 23 hours a day? He was allowed out 1 hour, and as you mentioned there, his health deteriorated. What were the conditions he was in Belmarsh?
He was under using condition both in the Ecuadorian embassy as well as in Belmarsh. Nils Meltzer, who was the UN Special Rapporteur for Torture, who investigated this and who went into his investigation biased against Julian Assange, and Meltzer explains that very clearly. But Meltzer, then, as he understands his case against Assange, one of the things he comes to write and to state very clearly is that Julian Assange is being tortured. One of the things they do with Julian Assange is when he's in Belmarsh is he is kept in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day. He is not allowed contact. He's allowed to leave the cell to exercise. Some days, he's supposed to be able to leave every day, but of course it doesn't happen. You can imagine the methods with which Julian Assange is treated, the information he's given, and the information taken away. His mental health state had already been perilous before going to Belmarsh, and the British authorities really jump on that. So what they do is they play, what we call mind games with him, in terms of offering him things, taking them away, promising things, not delivering on them, saying he would see his family, not allowing it to happen, as well as just being in the solitaire. And everyone who knows about this now understands fully and clearly that, and this is not just me saying, this is what essentially the world says at this point. The experts say at this point that solitary confinement is a form of torture. The human mind, our human spirit, who we are as human beings, we are just not able to withstand that type of isolation. We break down, we deteriorate. There are physical, mental, and spiritual consequences to being put in solitary confinement, and that's what Julian Assange is placed in. So, I mean, the idea is that they knew that Julian Assange's mental health and physical health were not well, and they put him in these conditions he didn't need to be in, conditions for which there was no reason to held him in. Again, this idea he was originally put in there for bail jumping. Well, the amount of time he was kept in prison far, far exceeded by years and years any reasonable amount of time to keep anybody in the British jail for bail jumping. The idea he was a flight risk is ridiculous as well. There was no way that this man was going to get out of Britain, I mean, essentially, that's what they do. He's not shackled to a wall. He's not waterboarded, but he is tortured mentally, emotionally, and spiritually in a way that is understood to be progressively deteriorative, to progressively degrade someone, to diminish somebody. And the idea being is that eventually he will break, and either he will collapse and die, or he will kill himself. And so even though he is, his doctors, I believe the British prison doctors say he has these risks and he is suicidal, that they don't do enough. Essentially, they're trying to have this happen. Again, the idea that if Julian Assange can die in prison, that's the best thing for the Americans, because again, the case never gets adjudicated, so it's still open-ended, it's still allowed to occur. And man, you want to go against this journalist, you want to go against this media organizations, guess what's going to happen? You're going to die in Belmarsh, just like Julian Assange. Belmarsh, to your point, Louis, old prison in London. It's where the Brits put the worst of the worst. And so Julian Assange is, surrounded by, murderers and rapists and, terrorists, what have you. And it really is. It's an attempt to kill him in prison before he actually has to stand trial in the U.S. For what he's accused of.
So you said that a couple of times, that you think that they was happy or hoping that he died in prison, or even tried to. So obviously the conditions there, 23 hours a day of solitary confinement is a form of torture. Like, you would go crazy. The isolation of that, nothing to do, wondering if you're ever going to get out. With all the years that led up to this, the power behind you, you'd be hopeless, lonely. No matter what you think of Julian Assange, you can't claim whatever he did. Like, you'd think, if someone told you those conditions in prison he was for, and then you had to guess the charge, you're never in a million years going to guess that's why he's there. You'd run off all the worst things possible, and you wouldn't even get near that. So it's disgusting that they could even do that, and people like Alan Duncan were so happy about this. And I wonder what he thought when he heard he's in there for 23 hours a day. Was he thinking, yeah, he deserves it?
And this is, I apologize for looking at my phone while you were talking. I was trying to find one of the articles Craig Murray has written about the conflict of interest, because it is so spectacular. I wanted to quote directly from it. I should have had that pulled up before we got on, because I knew you were going to ask me about it. But no one's day ever goes the way it's planned, right? It's like, because Louis, you sent me the outline of what you want to talk about, and I saw it this morning. I was like, all right, great. I got plenty of time to pull that stuff up, and and I get on with you like 3 minutes late and everything. So obviously that, but anyway, but yeah, I mean, to your point about, let's go back to the solitary thing, because there's an example I like to use about it, because if people remember the American television show, the Netflix television series, Orange is the New Black, about the woman who goes to prison. And in that show, and it's based on a true story, and it really, that show, I think, really strived to show what prison really was like. In that show, whenever the guards are upset with the inmates, or the inmates do something to displease the guards, or the guards just want to punish the inmates or demonstrate their power, they threaten the inmates with solitary confinement. And in the show, what happens is, at first, the inmates always like, whatever, put me in solitary. And then after they come out of solitary, they're devastated. And then later on in the show, when the guards threaten them with solitary again, the inmates are, I'll stop. I'll do whatever you say. What do you need me to do? Just don't send me back to solitary. I mean, so I think for a lot of people who don't understand it or recognize it, this idea of how destructive solitary is, and the idea that we're going to use this to kill Julian Assange is pretty well understood by people who understand what it actually is like. And then, and I'm sorry, what was the other point you brought up just before?
His conditions in prison. What about his health, or being in Belmarsh, or?
I think I thought you. I'm sorry. I thought you had said something. Had gone on to like another point.
I've lost my train of thought from where it was before. Solitary confinement, his conditions. If you said to someone, what was he in there for? No way in a million years you'd get there.
Well, that's what it was. That was my thought was this. This really shows you there's the punishment aspect of right? Of making an example of essentially putting Julian's head on a pike, right, as an example to others. But there's also, too, why are they putting him in this level? There's that. But there's also, too, this idea of this is the people who really scares us. The man like Julian Assange, this is who really scares us. This is who really threatens the empire. Julian Assange, exposing the truth of the empire is what frightens the empire. It's the same way too that you see someone like Daniel Hale, who American whistleblower, released drone files, showed a lot of information about the American drone assassination program, how thousands upon thousands of civilians were killed by the drone strikes, how the Americans knew they were killing thousands upon thousands, in terms of the number of people who would have to be killed to kill one high-value target, dozens upon dozens, the fact that the Americans deliberately targeted first responders with their drones, all types of criminal acts through the American extrajudicial assassination program utilizing their drones, Daniel demonstrated with documents. And, they put Daniel in prison for 3 years, and they sent him to Marion in Illinois. And he was in the specialized communication unit. And this is a unit that is not a supermax prison, as we call it here. It's not where the murderers and the serial killers and the worst of the worst are, as they be described. But this is a specialized containment unit that's still high security and is still denied any type of it's still very repressive, very oppressive. But the idea being is that they have almost no contact with the outside world. So that the ability for Daniel and others in this unit to receive correspondence, to read books, to talk. He was only allowed to talk to, he had a list of how many people he could talk to, and it was only a couple, and that was it. And if he wanted to talk to somebody else, someone else had to go off the list, and it was very restrictive in a way to, in another addition beyond solitary confinement, where you just were unable to communicate with the outside world. And why do they do this? Because they're so afraid of that truth telling. They're so afraid of the reality of what they are doing in their wars to be exposed, that they have to not just punish these people to make them as examples, but also too, they're terrified that somehow these people are going. This is the case with Julian. They were convinced that Julian, even though the embassy in the Ecuadorian embassy in London is arguably the most surveilled building in the world at that point. Nothing's getting in, nothing's getting out without it being smuggled in, like on paper, essentially, Julian Assange, and even that was difficult. They were convinced that Julian Assange was masterminding these WikiLeaks efforts around the world, that somehow Julian Assange from Belmarsh or from within the embassy was going to release more documents, when it's no way possible for him to do so. They still were so convinced that they had in their head of him as some type of Batman type of villain, like Batman, universe villain, like he's a Joker or the Penguin or someone, and he has to be kept this way because they were terrified of him. Not a rational terror, of course. The terror was that this man is the most dangerous thing to us. And this gets back to what the Nixon and Kissinger said about Dan Ellsberg, the Pentagon Papers whistleblower, was that Dan Ellsberg was the most dangerous man in America, right? Because he was exposing the truth of the war. And that was the most dangerous thing for the American government, the American empire, was to have that kind of truth exposed. And that, shows you why that treatment of Assange occurred, and how brutal it was and how deliberate it was. And it was meant not just as to serve as an example to others, but because the U.S. government was actually and genuinely afraid.
Yeah, of course, this is part of the greater discussion of the war on independent media and free speech. Recently in the UK, we've had certain journalists arrested, like Richard Medhurst.
Yeah.
And then I can't remember the other guy's name recently.
Mostly from electronic intifada. Yeah, Asa. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm blanking.
I'll put it up on the screen. He's ginger, glasses.
Yeah.
He's been arrested, mainly to do with their reporting, it would seem, about Israel specifically. So there's clearly, a war on information there. As you've mentioned, other journalists have been persecuted over the years. There's a clampdown on social media. You could talk about the TikTok bill, the general just constant Western government saying about disinformation, we need to clamp down on it on the internet. The biggest betrayers of disinformation never once apologized for any of their mistakes. Apparently, want to clamp down on dangerous misinformation on the internet and hate speech. There's clearly an effort to clamp back down on it. And it's funny when you look at the Western governments, because they have this image and convince people of, we or say we're democratic, we're for free speech, we're liberal with this, because that's the image that there is elements of that. Obviously, we're much freer than pretty much every other country around the world. I'm not disagreeing with that, but because we project that image to basically cover for everything else we do as part of the American empire, everything we do overseas, we can say we're democracies when we go after Russia and China. But because we actually create this image that we have to uphold to the public, they don't really like it, because they want to clamp down on free speech. They don't like it when it goes against them. Then suddenly all this democratic process, like the court system of Julian Assange, like keeping him in these conditions. If there was a political prisoner in Russia 23 hours a day, like Julian Assange, there'd be mayhem in the media. But when we do it, there's different reasons. So it's funny, they've trapped themselves in this democratic image, so they have to sort of play the game, like you said, with the court system, where maybe another country would just like, yeah, we're just going to extradite him. We can do that, like certain other countries around the world. We banned RT because of the Russia-Ukraine war. But when, Putin did at the BRICS conference the other day, he has journalists from all around the world, including the BBC, who he takes questions from for ages and ages and ages. We don't do that. We don't do that. But just to finish up here, there's a lot of other things to discuss, like other information WikiLeaks released, the Australians lobbying at the end and things like that. But I thought it would be good to maybe finish on, since you've actually met Julian Assange, just your thoughts on him as a person, when you met him, your conversations, and just on a personal touch, I guess, as it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, so I only met Julian Assange once, as I said before, in the embassy in Ecuador. Sorry, the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Excuse me. And he, I think we spoke about this in the previous episode, how I went into that meeting with him having a great deal of trepidation, because even though I was a supporter of him, even though I was supportive of WikiLeaks, I had been speaking publicly at that point for 4 years in defense of WikiLeaks. I still was taken by the propaganda, by the smears, by the lies about him, that he might be doing the right thing, but he's a flawed person. He's doing the right thing, but for the wrong motivations. That he's a narcissist. I went into this meeting, but I'll go meet with him. And within minutes of that meeting, that perception, that propaganda, that corruption of my understanding was dissolved. He very smart, very bright, quite brilliant. If I had to rank the 5 or 10 most brilliant people I've ever met in my life, he'd be one of them. Level of intelligence that I've encountered only a few times, similar to Dan Ellsberg, that type of level of intelligence. And Dan was a friend of mine, and I feel Dan felt the same way about Julian. But so you're in this meeting. I'm in this meeting with him. There's two or three other people with me, and we spent about 3 hours with him. Obviously, he's been in the embassy now for a couple of years. And he's lonely, so he's happy to talk for a few hours, but not, it's not that. It's the fact that he's genuinely interested in who you are. He understood who we were, what our backgrounds were, who we represented, what we spoke out about. And so he was genuinely interested in us. So all the smears, all the lies, all the discrediting that had been done to distract people away from the central issue of this, right? That Julian Assange was exposing the crimes of the American government. Those when I met him, those evaporated. Yeah, I would say the same too for his family and his the men and women who work for WikiLeaks. They really generally do believe in their purpose as exposing government crimes, as providing for the transparency of governments, allowing for people and citizens to know what their governments are actually doing, so that governments and corporations. I do this a lot. You know, WikiLeaks was not set up, was not founded to just speakly disclose information about governments, but also corporations as well, and they've done that quite a bit. You know, but to have some level of transparency and accountability in our societies. And so the men and women who are part of WikiLeaks, I have found to be very principled people. That these are not hacktivists. These are not just agents of chaos who want to cause disruption. These are not like pro-Russian or pro-Chinese or pro-whoever, fifth columnists. These are men and women, again, who believe in these principles, who have these values. And that's I found that over these years, this last decade or so, decade and a half, to be the case. And I'd be interested in, of course, like everyone, we're all interested to see what Julian Assange will do. I think we were all so glad at what we saw in him, that intelligence, that brilliance, that understanding and ability to articulate his view of the world that we saw in Strasbourg last month when he's the first and only time he's spoken publicly since he's been released. I think all of us are selfish in the sense that we want him to do more, that we want him to do WikiLeaks 2.0 or whatever, whatever he's going to do next, because we feel we need him. We're human beings. We want a leader. We see people we aspire to. We recognize people who have sacrificed, right? And we see that in him, and selfishly we demand more. Whatever Julian Assange does, he owes nothing to anybody. Certainly what he has done, the cost that he and his family have borne over these years, is more than anyone could ask of anyone for anything. And so to ask him for anything further is, again, selfish. But I have to also understand, I believe that this is a person who was motivated in providing a public good, doing these acts of exposing government and corporations as a public service. And I don't think he walks away from that. And of course, I think too, just looking at it, his experience, why would he walk away from it? I mean, certainly his health issues, he's missed his family. I mean, he never, until, this past summer, he had never seen his children essentially outside of either the embassy or the prison. Yeah, I mean, I think we're all very interested in to see what Julian Assange will do next. But at the same time saying that too, if he does nothing, he's already done more than, nearly everyone else has ever done.
Yeah, no, he definitely deserves just to make that decision himself.
Right.
So it would be a tough one, because you could go, I want to be a symbol that they didn't beat me down and I'm going to get back at it, just for maybe inspiration of others, even if you're lying. Or you could just go, guys, someone else has to pick up.
Exactly.
I just need to see my family and get my head back to normal, because he must be extremely mentally damaged. And I just want to see his kids and the family, and no one could blame that for him. But I know his wife is obviously, I think she's recently, again, I know I keep mentioning him, but recently joined kind of the team over at Declassified UK, maybe as an advisor. I'm sure his children, after they grow up and find out about it, will probably go on to do similar things to him. I'm sure they'll be motivated.
His brother Gabriel was very much involved in all this, in his brother's defense, his brother's release. Certainly, I think where Gabriel goes to will be interesting to see. Gabriel, incredibly competent and capable, very passionate as well, even though he's so soft-spoken and calm. And Stella, certainly be very remiss that we didn't talk about Stella for just even a brief moment. Her strength, her inspiration. I'm almost actually getting choked up thinking about her. Back in May, when I was there in London outside the court, and it came out that Julian had won the right to appeal. And it was an amazing thing to be a part of, the way that news, that knowledge flowed through the crowd. It was unlike anything. I'm struggling to find a comparison in my life to being that energy, what occurred there that day. And her steadfastness, her leadership at that time, her place in front of all of us, leading us in her husband's defense. I remember thinking, because I was interviewing all kinds of people, I was doing the live streams, I was interviewing Jerry Corbyn and all these people, right? And I remember thinking after she got on the stage and made a speech to the crowd, thinking like, I don't want to interview Stella because I'm not going to be able to hold it together. I'm going to lose it if I have to talk to her because I'm so struck by her and her courage and what she's going through and her presence and her poise and her steadfastness all these years. But now in this moment, I don't think I could stand in front of her and not break down because I'm so awed by her and so my connection in that sense. So certainly what Stella will do, I had not heard about Declassified UK. That's great. I mean, Declassified UK, fantastic organization. That's Matt Kennard, right? And I mean, really terrific, really great. People aren't familiar with them. Follow them. Read Matt Kennard's book, The Racket. I mean, really tremendous journalist. But yeah, I mean, so interesting to see too what Stella does. And I don't know, maybe Julian, and Stella, this team, God knows what we'll see from them.
Yeah, no, Declassified do good work. It's also Mark Curtis over there and Phil. I can't remember his second name. I'll put it up, but yeah, loads of good articles, especially for UK news. But it's very tied into the US because they're tied at the hip together. But I'll leave it there. I think we covered a lot of ground there. Hopefully, people can see the criminality of the collusion and conspiracy between, you have the British government, the American government, the Australians playing their part of just doing nothing until the end, it would seem. The Ecuadorian government, the Swedish government, the Spanish Spanish agency that's spying on behalf of the CIA, and whoever else is involved, and whoever else put pressure on the US. A lot of things were released about the Gulf nations and Israel and across the board and NATO in general. But hopefully, I think we covered a lot of information across the two interviews. And yeah, just really glad for WikiLeaks to exist. Every time I read a book, there's interesting insight into how just diplomats and people talk behind closed doors. How does Hillary Clinton, what are they talking about her and Jake Sullivan or whoever it may be? Because they're not talking about democracy and all this stuff. It's much more nefarious and much more corporate interests and turning blind eyes because to the Saudis, whatever it may be. But I don't want to go on another tangent. But I'd encourage people to go out there and read some of the works you suggested. I'll put it up on the screen, put it in the show notes as always. But thanks for coming on for 2 times now to lay it all out. And I hope to speak to you soon.
All right. Thank you, Louis.